Hello, I'm Dalton Delan. I'm a columnist for the Berkshire Eagle, and this is Eagle Reels, where we take you beyond the news. My very special guest today, Dennis G. Pregent, author of Berkshire Heroes in WW2. Welcome, Dennis.
It's nice to meet you, Dalton.
Thank you. Dennis, you were raised in Adams and North Adams, and at 17, you enlisted in the Marine Corps, and you did 7 years at the height of Vietnam. What were you thinking when you went in? What were you feeling when you came out?
Well, at 17, I wanted to see the world. I didn't think about Vietnam at the time, and I enlisted right in the middle of my senior year. And I was taught, it was a good experience for me in many ways about responsibility, accountability, camaraderie, selflessness, and I enjoyed it.
Well, you went back later, and your first book tells the stories of a dozen of your 1965 classmates from St. Joseph's, all but one of whom, I believe, went to Vietnam. Did it help you and them to tell those stories?
It did. There was 11 of us that I contacted, all classmates. And I think after 50 years, we could tell our stories more casually or more confident with more confidence. And there was 7 soldiers, 3 Marines, and 1 sailor. And I had comments from the after the book was published, and even during the interviews, of how the spouses had never heard their husbands talk about the war. So I think it had some catharsis for all of us. Most of us are disabled in one form or another, either through gunshot wounds or impacts on landing with, and a couple are paratroopers. Some have PTSD. I think out of the 11, those that are still living, I think all of them had some sort of disability.
You began to write in retirement after a career in human resources. You were often, I think, interviewing people for positions. You did it as part of hiring people. Now you interview people to write history, or you interview relatives and research to write history. Is this a continuum based on a certain love of people?
It is, and it's funny you make the connection. It took me a while to make the connection. Part of my job in human resources, a great part of it was interviewing people for hours on end. And at the time, I didn't really relish it after a number of years of doing it, but I didn't realize it was giving me the skills to talk to family, to talk to some of the people in my first book. It was very helpful. And I find I enjoy capturing their stories. And it was helpful to me.
So your new book, Berkshire Heroes in WW2, it tells the stories of more than 24 soldiers from the Berkshires, most of them deceased. Now, some would contend that telling the history of individuals is sort of a projected way of bringing people you love back to life. Do you feel that?
Oh, absolutely. I like the way you phrase that. When I talk about this latest book, it was a book for me, there was a lot of nostalgia in it, going back, seeing how these men and women were brought up in the 40s, when life was simpler, when selflessness was for the good of others was a common trait. And like you said, there's 28 different stories of men and women, anywhere from a paratrooper who was a POW and then wounded to somebody who was on a PT boat and taught John F. Kennedy how to use the radio. And then I visited a number of cemeteries also. So and for months, I was in this little bubble of really appreciating all that they had done for us.
Well, you brought up one of the stories They're all interesting. But you brought up one that obviously I think viewers could be very interested in. John F. Kennedy, who ended up on PT 109. Now, could you tell us the story you were just alluding to about the soldier who taught him on another PT boat how to operate the radio and so forth?
Well, Fernando Berti is the person I'm talking about. I worked with his sons to pull together his history, but he trained on a PT boat and became so accomplished that they used him as a trainer. And one of the early people he trained was John F. Kennedy. And he even made the comment, and he's a pretty good Joe. He's not an elitist like some thought. I got along with him quite well. And I thought that was an interesting story. It's interesting, Dalton. There's 28 stories, and some of them, when people first referred the names to me, I thought, is there much of a story here? But back then, from 1941 to 1945, every one of these stories was harrowing in one way or another. Bertie went on to be in the Pacific for a number of months. And it's in addition to a radio man, he was a gunner on the back of the boat. So there was many narrow escapes they had.
Did he have a chance later on either to meet with JFK or was he known to have commented on, excuse me, on that experience?
I know of, he never met with JFK after that. He had one tale he relayed to his sons that I thought was interesting. After a large battle in the Pacific, they were out on patrol. The patrol boat can go 300 or 400 miles. And they came across a Japanese sailor hanging onto a log, all burnt from the sun. He'd been out there for days. And they just drove by him and let him go. They had no room on their boat for prisoners of war, and they left him to his demise. I thought that was an interesting tale. I found a number of tales from people, whether they were POWs or PT boat radio operators. There's one gentleman from Williamstown, since passed, but I have his history, captured the first prisoner of war in World War II. He was based in Hawaii, and after the attack on Hawaii, he had a patrol that went along the beach, just making sure they weren't coming back to attack again. And they found a midget submarine grounded, and there was one survivor, and they captured him. His patrol wanted to execute him right there on the spot, but he thought the intelligence services might have better use. So this man from Williamstown captured the United States first prisoner of war, and then went on to fly 60 missions in Europe. The most interesting thing about all of these people is some of them attained the ranks of lieutenant or captain, but even after all their experiences, they came back home, and a number of them just went back to work in a mill, or they just picked up where they left off. Their goal was get married, raise a family, and get on with their life. And for the most part, all of them did that.
From your own experience and as well as having written books on both of these seminal wars that America participated in, is that experience different from that of your fellow soldiers who fought in Vietnam? And if so, did it relate to something about the culture or something about how many men went over and women or how they were received when they came home? Have you thought about those differences?
I've thought about it. Now, most of the ones in my book, The Boys of St. Joe in the Vietnam, 65 in the Vietnam War, all of our dads were in the military. And I can say for most of us, unless you were seriously injured, most of us came back home, picked up where we left off. I myself was trying to make up for 7 years military service. So I entered the college at 24, trying to make up for the time that I spent in the service. And I often thought my peers were ahead of me because of that time lapse. Um, and of all the people in the book, they pretty much did the same thing. Got back, got married, got a good job or got educated, and went to work. So there was a lot of similarities between us and our fathers.
Thank you. That's good to hear. Now, another story you tell is a living centenarian, very much still with us, Chizo. Could you tell us a
So,
little bit about his story?
um, just a wonderful man. He's 102 years old. As I gather names of people, their stories are important, I gather names from different sources. Chizo's name kept coming up, and he was the only living person in this latest book of mine, Berkshire Heroes. So I went to visit him, and he lives in Cheshire, Massachusetts, and he's got a little man cave where he keeps souvenirs of his life. He played semi-pro baseball. At 11 years old, he was a trapper. He trapped otters and mink, helped support his family. But the most interesting thing was just sitting back and letting him talk to me about Iwo Jima and what it was like to be there and how it was difficult to dig a hole in the dark sand. The sand would keep collapsing, and how you had to stay as low as you could because the bullets were coming so fast. How they really didn't have water for a long period of time unless the Seabees brought it to them off of boats. I felt like I was sitting looking at a history book as I was talking to him. There's a picture in his section where he's at a cemetery on Iwo Jima, and he's at the grave of a Marine named John Basilone. And John was given the Medal of Honor in Guadalcanal and said he still wanted to fight. So he came to Iwo Jima, was killed there. He's a famous Marine for those of us that in the Marine Corps. And Chizo's got a picture of him kneeling by his temporary grave. So Chizo was a great person to talk to.
You both served in different areas of the Pacific. Was that a common ground that you felt with him?
Well, I served some time on Okinawa. I think he passed through there. It's always helpful to be a veteran and have some of those experiences. It seems to break down walls of people talking to you. Chizo and I got along famously. But in the first book, The Boys of St. Joe, 65 in the Vietnam War, being a veteran, being over there, spending the time in, breaks down all those walls that sometimes garble communication.
So Chizo is again at 102, still with us. And has he had a chance to see his story in the book? And if so, how does he feel about that?
I don't know the answer to that. He has seen his story. I sent every person who I write about, I sent them their chapter ahead of time before it's published, because I want to make sure it's accurate and I don't want to say anything that would make anybody uncomfortable. So I sent it to Chizo and his grandson. His grandson and his son take care of Chizo. They make him breakfast, give him haircuts. And I'm looking forward to meeting him. I'm going to meet him when I go back to the Berkshires shortly.
Wonderful. Well, now you're going back to the Berkshires for some speaking events. And how should viewers find where those events are so that they can come hear you? And tell us a little bit about what you'll be doing in those engagements. But please tell us, where will we find the events?
Well, they can go to DennisPregent.com and find a schedule of events there. I'll be speaking at the 3 local libraries, Adams, North Adams, and Williamstown Historical Museum, and at Legions in those 2 towns, American Legions. So the time is posted on my website. Usually the events, I love going to them. There's a good attendance. I'll usually read portions of my book first, and then I open it up to questions. And the questions are all over the board, and I enjoy them. It keeps you on your feet. But, I just started writing about 5 years ago. And, I've come to really enjoy what I do. I enjoy capturing people's stories that would probably never get told. So I'll have 5 events up there in beginning October 8th.
What would you like readers to take away from this book, Dennis?
The biggest thing for me, and I think they will once they read it, is the selflessness. People that have never been more than 50 miles from their hometown were all of a sudden sent across the world, usually not knowing where they were going, asked to do something that they would have never been in civilian life, and they all responded. And I think that selflessness is what impressed me so much. Courage, dedication. I write about people from the Adams, North Adams, Williamstown area. That's sort of become, it's the area I grew up in, it's the area I know best. And, that little corner of Massachusetts, the population together, all three, is about less than 30,000 people. And in the state of Massachusetts, that's less than 3%, but they just have such a big effect. And I just enjoy talking to them.
Well, can you give us a hint? What's on your mind for our next book?
I'm already working on it. I want to do, again, staying with the 3 same towns, but I want to write about the Civil War in the Berkshires, 1861 to 1865. And I've already had some help by the local historians and the museums.
I can't wait to read that one. Absolutely. Dennis G. Pregent, Staff Sergeant Pregent, thank you for your service. Thank you for joining us today. Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this as I have, and I hope that you are already a subscriber to the Berkshire Eagle. If you're not yet, please consider becoming one. That's how we have these sorts of conversations and how we keep local journalism alive and vibrant in this country. I'm Dalton Delan. I'll see you next time on Eagle Reels and in the pages of the Berkshire Eagle.